spoiled sheriff's son married a saloon girl. Her first demand shocked his entire family. The dust had barely settled from the carriage wheels when Thomas helped his new wife down onto the cobblestone path that led to his family's grand house. Rose stepped carefully, her worn boots finding purchase on stones that had never known the weight of anything but polished leather and Sunday shoes. Her dress, plain brown cotton with tiny flowers that had faded from too many washings, caught the afternoon light like autumn leaves ready to fall. Thomas watched her take in the sight of his childhood home. 3 stories of white-painted wood and glass windows that sparkled like diamonds in the sun. The house sat proud on the hill above town, its wraparound porch decorated with carved railings and hanging baskets full of his mother's prized roses. Everything about it whispered of money and position, of a family that had never known hunger or uncertainty. Rose's fingers touched the small gold ring on her left hand, turning it slowly as if to remind herself it was real. Thomas had bought it from the jeweler in town just 3 days ago, spending more money in one afternoon than she had seen in 6 months of serving drinks and dodging grabbing hands at the Silver Dollar Saloon. The ring was too big for her thin finger, but she had wrapped a piece of thread around the band to keep it from sliding off. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who had learned to speak gently in loud places. Her eyes took in the perfectly trimmed hedges, the painted shutters, the brass knocker shaped like an eagle. Everything was clean and bright and untouched by the grit of real living. The front door opened before they reached it. Thomas's mother, Eleanor, stood in the doorway wearing a dress of deep blue silk that probably cost more than Rose had earned in her entire life. Her gray hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, not a strand out of place. Behind her stood Thomas's father, Sheriff William Hawthorne, his badge catching the light like a small sun pinned to his vest. "Thomas," his mother said, her voice carrying the kind of warmth reserved for family dinners and church socials. But when her eyes moved to Rose, that warmth flickered like a candle in the wind. "And this must be your bride." The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Rose felt it settle on her shoulders along with the weight of their stares. She had known this moment would come, had known it since the first night Thomas had sat at her table in the saloon, drinking whiskey and talking about loneliness instead of trying to buy her company for the night. "Mother, father," Thomas said, his hand finding Rose's elbow with gentle pressure. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Rose." Rose Hawthorne now. The name sounded strange in his mouth, like he was still getting used to the shape of it. Rose had been Rose Murphy for 22 years, a name that carried the weight of poverty and hard choices. Rose Hawthorne felt like wearing someone else's coat, warm and beautiful, but not quite the right size. Sheriff Hawthorne stepped forward first, extending his hand with the practiced politeness of a man who dealt with all kinds of people in his line of work. "Welcome to the family, Rose," he said, and she could hear him trying to mean it. His handshake was firm but brief, like touching something that might be catching. Eleanor's greeting was cooler still. She offered her hand like she was passing a fragile piece of china, barely touching Rose's calloused fingers before pulling away. "How lovely," she murmured, though her eyes said otherwise. Come in. Dinner will be ready soon." The inside of the house was even grander than the outside. Rose's boots clicked on polished hardwood floors that reflected the light from a crystal chandelier hanging in the front hall. Oil paintings in golden frames lined the walls, portraits of stern-faced men and women who looked like they had never smiled a day in their lives. The furniture was dark wood and rich fabric, everything arranged just so, like a picture in a magazine. Thomas led her up a wide staircase to the second floor, past more paintings and a tall window that looked out over the town below. She could see the main street from here, dusty and small, with the Silver Dollar Saloon sitting squat and honest among the other buildings. It looked different from up here, smaller somehow, like a toy version of the place where she had spent the last 4 years of her life. Their room was at the end of the hall, large and bright with windows on 2 sides and a bed big enough for 4 people. Rose set her small bag, everything she owned in the world, on a chair that probably cost more than most folks made in a month. The bag looked tiny and shabby against the chair's rich fabric, like a sparrow that had wandered into a peacock's nest. "It's a lot," Thomas said quietly, watching her face. I know it's different from what you're used to. Rose nodded, running her hand along the smooth surface of the dresser. Her reflection looked back at her from the mirror above it. A thin woman with brown hair that escaped its pins and eyes that had seen too much. She looked tired, she thought. She looked like she didn't belong. Your mother doesn't like me much, she said. Not as a question but as a simple fact, like saying the sky was blue or water was wet. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. She doesn't know you yet, he finally said. But they both heard the doubt in his voice. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 people comfortably. Rose sat at Thomas's right side at one end of a table so long she could have laid down on it from end to end. The dishes were fine china painted with tiny blue flowers, and there were more forks and knives at her place setting than she had owned in her entire life. She watched Eleanor carefully, copying which fork to use and when to place her napkin in her lap. The food was rich and plentiful. Roast beef that fell apart at the touch of a fork, potatoes swimming in butter, vegetables she couldn't even name. At the saloon, she had lived on bread and beans and whatever scraps the cook would share. This meal would have fed her for a week. They ate in careful silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against china and the tick of a grandfather clock standing guard in the corner. Rose could feel Eleanor's eyes on her, watching the way she held her fork, the way she cut her meat, looking for signs of the life she had lived before. Finally, when the last plate had been cleared and coffee had been poured into cups so delicate Rose was afraid to breathe on them, she found her voice. Mrs. Hawthorne, she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I know this isn't what you wanted for Thomas. I know you probably had other plans. Someone from a good family, someone who knows how to live in a house like this. Eleanor's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Sheriff Hawthorne looked up from his pipe. Thomas reached for Rose's hand under the table, but she gently pulled away. I can't change where I came from, Rose continued, her voice steady despite the way her heart was beating against her ribs. I can't pretend I know which fork to use or how to make conversation about things I never learned. But I love your son. And if you'll let me, I'd like to ask you for something. The silence stretched out like a held breath. Eleanor set down her cup with a sound like breaking glass. What is it you want? She asked, and her voice carried all the suspicion of a woman who had dealt with gold diggers and fortune hunters before. Rose looked down at her hands. Hands that had scrubbed floors and served drinks and counted coins until her fingers were raw. I want to learn to read, she said simply. Not just my name or numbers for making change. I want to read books and newspapers and letters. Thomas stared at her. His parents exchanged a look across the table that spoke volumes without words. You can't read? Eleanor asked, and there was something in her voice that might have been surprise or might have been disdain. I can read some, Rose said, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. Enough to get by, but I want to learn more. I want to be able to write letters to my sister back in Missouri. I want to read to the children I hope to have someday. The grandfather clock ticked through another silence. Sheriff Hawthorne cleared his throat. Eleanor smoothed her napkin with precise movements. There's a schoolmarm in town, Thomas said finally. Mrs. Peterson. She might... No, Rose said softly. I want to learn here. In this house. If your mother would teach me. Eleanor's face went through a series of expressions like clouds passing over the sun. Shock, then something that might have been offense, then calculation, then something softer that Rose couldn't quite read. You want me to teach you? Eleanor repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. Yes, ma'am, if you're willing. The silence that followed was different from the others. Deeper somehow, like the moment before dawn when the whole world holds its breath. Rose felt the weight of their judgment, their surprise, their careful consideration of what her request might mean. Thomas was looking at his mother with something like hope in his eyes. Sheriff Hawthorne was studying Rose as if seeing her for the first time. And Eleanor. Eleanor was staring at the saloon girl who had married her son, and was now asking not for money or jewelry or fine clothes, but for something that couldn't be bought or sold. Why me? Eleanor asked at last. Rose considered the question seriously. Because you're his mother, she said simply. Because this is going to be my home now, and I want to belong here. Really belong, not just take up space. And because, she paused, searching for the right words. Because I think you might want to understand who I am before you decide what kind of woman I'll be for your son. Something shifted in the room like the first hint of wind before a storm. Eleanor's face softened just a fraction, and for a moment Rose caught a glimpse of the woman behind the fine clothes and careful manners. A woman who had raised a son and run a household and made a life in this dusty frontier town. We'll start tomorrow, Eleanor said quietly, and Rose felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, like a fist finally opening after holding on too long. The next morning came soft and gold through the bedroom windows, but Rose was already awake when Thomas stirred. She sat by the window in her nightgown, looking out at the town below where smoke was beginning to rise from morning fires. Her hands were folded in her lap, and something about the stillness of her shoulders told him she had been sitting there for a long time. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly, not wanting to break the peace of the early hour. She turned to him with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I keep thinking about today. About sitting in that fancy parlor with your mother, trying to learn letters like a child." Thomas sat up, running a hand through his hair. In the morning light, Rose looked younger somehow, more fragile than the composed woman who had faced his parents at dinner. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to. We could find another way." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I need to do this. Not for her, not even for you. For me." She paused, her fingers worrying the edge of her nightgown. "And for Lily." It was the first time she had spoken her sister's name since their wedding day. Thomas had heard bits and pieces of Rose's story in their quiet conversations at the saloon. How she had raised her younger sister after their parents died. How she had worked whatever jobs she could find to keep them fed. But Rose guarded those memories like precious things, sharing them only in whispers. "Tell me about her," he said gently. Rose was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft as morning mist. "She's 16 now. 16 and working in a factory back in Missouri, making shirts for 12 hours a day. Her letters come maybe once a month, when she can afford the postage." She reached into the small bag beside her chair and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. "This is the last one I got 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Chun at the general store read it to me. Lily wrote that her hands are getting cut up from the machines, and she's so tired all the time. But she also wrote that she's been teaching herself numbers, and she wants to save enough money to come west." Thomas watched his wife's face as she spoke, seeing the love and worry etched in every line. "You want to write back to her. I want to tell her I'm married now, that I have a good man who treats me kindly. I want to tell her about this house and the mountains and how the air smells different here. I want to tell her she doesn't have to work in that factory forever, that maybe there's a place for her here too." The weight of understanding settled on Thomas like a heavy coat. Rose wasn't learning to read for herself. She was learning for love. For the sister who had stayed behind, who was cutting her hands on factory machines, while Rose slept in a soft bed and ate from china plates. "Mother will teach you," he said. She gave her word. Rose nodded, but her smile was uncertain. "Your mother doesn't like me, Thomas. She looks at me and sees everything I've done. Everything I've been. She sees the saloon and the men who tried to buy pieces of me. She sees someone who doesn't belong in her world." Before Thomas could answer, a knock came at the door. His mother's voice, crisp and proper, called through the wood. "Rose? I'm ready to begin your lessons when you are." They found Eleanor in the morning parlor, a room Thomas remembered from his childhood lessons in penmanship and arithmetic. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, falling across a small writing desk where his mother had arranged paper, ink, and several well-worn books. She wore a simple gray dress today, her hair pulled back in its usual perfect style, but her hands showed the slight tremor that always came when she was nervous. "I thought we'd start with the alphabet," Eleanor said as Rose settled into the chair across from her. "And then simple words. Do you know your letters?" "Some of them," Rose admitted. I learned a few at the mission school when I was small before. She didn't finish the sentence, but Eleanor seemed to understand. They began with the letter A. Eleanor's voice patient as she showed Rose how to form the shape with careful strokes. Rose's hand trembled slightly as she tried to copy the movement, her fingers unused to holding a pen properly. Thomas watched from the doorway, seeing his mother's surprise at Rose's careful attention, her determination to get each letter right. Your hand is too tight, Eleanor observed. Hold the pen like you're holding a bird. Firm enough that it won't fly away, gentle enough that you won't hurt it. As the morning wore on, Thomas began to see something he had never noticed before. His mother, for all her refinement and social graces, was a good teacher. She had patience for Rose's mistakes, encouragement for her small victories. And Rose absorbed every instruction like dry ground soaking up rain. But it was what happened after lunch that changed everything. Thomas's father came home early from his rounds, bringing with him two of the town's most prominent citizens, Judge Morrison and banker Henry Walsh. They were shown into the main parlor, where Eleanor was serving tea and discussing plans for the church social. Thomas could hear their voices from the front hall, comfortable and familiar in the way of old friends. I heard young Thomas brought home quite a surprise, Judge Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the jovial tone of a man sharing gossip. A working girl from the Silver Dollar, wasn't it? Thomas felt his stomach drop. He was about to enter the room when he heard his father's response. She seems pleasant enough, Sheriff Hawthorne said carefully. Though one wonders what the boy was thinking. There are plenty of suitable young ladies in town. Oh, we all know what he was thinking, banker Walsh chuckled. The same thing every young man thinks when he's had too much to drink and not enough sense. The question is why he felt the need to marry her. Eleanor's voice came next, cool and measured. My son is a grown man. He makes his own choices. Of course, Judge Morrison said quickly. But surely you understand our concern. A sheriff's son, marrying a saloon girl. It reflects on the whole family. On the whole community, really? Perhaps, the banker added helpfully. It's not too late to have the marriage annulled. These frontier marriages, sometimes they're not entirely legal. A small payment to the girl, and she could disappear back where she came from. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas felt heat rising in his chest. Anger at these men who spoke about his wife like she was a problem to be solved. But before he could move, he heard footsteps on the stairs behind him. Rose stood halfway down the staircase, her face pale but composed. She had changed into her brown dress, the same one she had worn when she arrived, and her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. In her hands she carried a piece of paper, covered with the careful letters she had been practicing all morning. She walked past Thomas without a word and entered the parlor. The conversation stopped like a door slamming shut. Good afternoon, gentlemen, Rose said quietly. I'm Rose Hawthorne. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Thomas watched Judge Morrison's face turn red, watched banker Walsh fidget with his hat. His mother sat frozen, her teacup suspended halfway to her lips. I know what you all think of me, Rose continued, her voice steady despite the slight shake in her hands. I know the stories you've heard and the assumptions you've made. But I want you to know something. She held up the paper with her morning's practice letters. This morning, Mrs. Hawthorne began teaching me to read and write. Not because I asked for charity, not because I want to pretend to be something I'm not, but because I have a sister back in Missouri who is working her fingers to bone in a factory, and I want to write her a letter telling her that there's hope in this world. The room was so quiet Thomas could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the dining room. I've never stolen anything, Rose said. I've never lied to get what I wanted. I worked hard for every penny I earned, and I kept myself and my sister alive when we had nothing and no one. Your son married me not because he was drunk or foolish, but because he saw something in me worth loving. And if that threatens you somehow, if a poor girl learning her letters is dangerous to your fine community, then maybe the problem isn't with me. She set the paper down on Eleanor's side table and walked toward the door. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me, Mrs. Hawthorne. I thought I might help with preparations for supper. After she left, the silence stretched on until it became unbearable. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Banker Walsh studied his boots. Sheriff Hawthorne looked like a man who had swallowed something bitter. It was Eleanor who spoke first. "Gentlemen," she said in her coldest, most proper voice, "I believe you have other appointments to keep." They left quickly, mumbling apologies and explanations that fooled no one. When the door closed behind them, Thomas found his parents in the parlor, his mother still holding her teacup, his father staring out the window. "She defended herself," Eleanor said quietly, as if the idea surprised her. "She defended all of us," Thomas corrected. "She defended this family." That evening, long after supper had been cleared and his parents had retired to their room, Thomas found Rose in the kitchen. She sat at the simple wooden table where the cook prepared meals, a candle burning beside her as she practiced forming letters by its flickering light. Her tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, the way children do when they're learning something difficult. The sight of her there, alone and determined, working by candlelight to bridge the gap between her old life and her new one, made something shift in Thomas's chest. This woman, who had been judged and dismissed and treated like a problem to be solved, was sitting in his family's kitchen trying to write a letter to her sister. Love, he realized, wasn't about the size of the house you could provide or the fine clothes you could buy. It wasn't about protecting someone from the world's cruelty or shielding them from judgment. Love was about sitting beside someone in the candlelight while they struggled with something difficult, and believing in their strength to overcome it. The lessons with Eleanor continued each morning, but they moved like molasses in winter, slow and careful, with long pauses between each small victory. Eleanor was patient but formal, keeping a careful distance even as she guided Rose's hand across the paper. Rose felt the gap between them like a cold wind, polite but unbridgeable. It was Thomas who changed everything. 3 days after the confrontation with Judge Morrison and Banker Walsh, he found Rose in the kitchen again, struggling with words by candlelight. This time, instead of simply watching from the doorway, he pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the paper covered with her careful attempts at writing her sister's name. Rose looked surprised but moved the candle so they could both see. "Your mother says I hold the pen wrong. Says I press too hard and make the letters look angry." Thomas studied her work. The L in Lily that looked like it was leaning against a strong wind. The Y that curled like a snake ready to strike. They did look fierce, he thought, but not angry. They looked determined. "Show me how you learned," he said. Rose's cheeks colored. "I didn't learn proper. When I was 8, there was a mission school for about 6 months before the preacher moved on. Then later, at the saloon, sometimes men would leave newspapers behind. I taught myself to read prices and numbers, enough to make change and not get cheated. But writing," she shook her head, "never had much call for it." Thomas reached for a fresh piece of paper. "My first teacher wasn't my mother," he said. "It was Maria Santos, the cook we had when I was small. She taught me letters in the kitchen while she made tortillas. Said learning was like making bread. You had to knead it gentle-like, not force it." He wrote the word "dear" at the top of the page, his letters flowing smooth and easy. "Every letter to family starts this way. Like opening a door." Rose watched his hand move, saw how he barely pressed the pen to paper, how each letter seemed to dance into place. "You make it look like music," she said softly. "Words can be music," Thomas agreed. "They can be anything you want them to be." Night after night, they sat together at that kitchen table while the house slept around them. Thomas would write a word, and Rose would copy it beneath, her letters growing stronger and clearer with each attempt. He taught her how to spell Missouri and factory and mountains. He showed her how to write, "I miss you," and "I love you," and "Please be safe." These quiet hours became something neither of them had expected. In the soft circle of lamplight, with the world reduced to just the two of them and the scratch of pen on paper, they talked in ways they never had before. Rose told him about Lily's laugh, how it sounded like water running over stones. Thomas told her about his childhood fears, How he used to think the portraits on the walls were watching him, judging him. I never felt good enough for them, he admitted one night. Watching Rose practice writing the word, hope. Everything I did, they had done better. Every choice I made, they had a better suggestion. Sometimes I think they were more disappointed in me than angry about the marriage. Rose looked up from her paper. You think they wanted you to fail? No, Thomas said slowly. I think they wanted me to succeed, but only in the ways they understood. Marry the right girl, take over father's position, live the life they planned. When I chose you, I chose something they couldn't control. And now you regret it, Rose said quietly. Thomas reached across the table and covered her ink-stained fingers with his hand. The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to see you clearly. Really see you. By the end of 2 weeks, Rose had written her first complete sentence. Dear Lily, I am married now to a good man. The words sprawled across the page like a child's attempt. But they were hers, formed by her own hand, carrying her own thoughts across the miles to the sister she missed like a piece of her heart. She was working on the second line, trying to spell mountains for the third time, when Sheriff Hawthorne walked into the kitchen. They hadn't heard his footsteps on the stairs, hadn't heard the creak of the floorboards in the hall. Suddenly he was just there, filling the doorway in his nightclothes, his face dark with something between surprise and anger. What's this? He asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to asking questions and getting answers. Rose's hand froze over the paper. Thomas straightened in his chair but didn't let go of her fingers. Rose is writing a letter to her sister, he said calmly. I can see that. Sheriff Hawthorne stepped into the kitchen, his eyes taking in the scattered papers, the ink-stained pen, the intimacy of their bent heads in the lamplight. What I want to know is why you're doing your mother's job. Eleanor is perfectly capable of teaching basic letters. Mother teaches fine, Thomas said carefully. But Rose wanted to work on it more, and I wanted to help. Every night. The sheriff's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. Sitting here together, alone, until all hours? Rose started to speak, but Sheriff Hawthorne held up a hand. I wasn't talking to you. The dismissal hit like a slap. Thomas felt Rose flinch beside him, saw her start to gather up the papers as if preparing to leave. Instead, he tightened his grip on her hand. You are talking to my wife, Thomas said, his voice carrying a firmness his father had rarely heard from him. And in this house, she deserves the same respect you'd give any family member. Father and son stared at each other across the kitchen table. The lamplight flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Rose sat perfectly still, barely breathing, caught between the two men like a mouse between two cats. Don't presume to tell me how to behave in my own house, boy, Sheriff Hawthorne said, his voice low and dangerous. Then don't presume to treat my wife like a servant in hers, Thomas shot back. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Sheriff Hawthorne's face went through several changes, surprise, anger, then something that might have been grudging respect. He looked at his son as if seeing him for the first time. You think marrying a saloon girl makes you a man? He asked finally. Thomas stood up slowly, still holding Rose's hand. I think standing up for the people I love makes me a man. I think keeping my word makes me a man. And I think treating everyone with dignity, regardless of where they come from, makes me the kind of man you raised me to be. Sheriff Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face. Then his eyes moved to Rose, taking in her pale cheeks, her careful posture, the way she held herself ready to flee but refused to look away. You really love her, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. More than I knew it was possible to love anyone, Thomas answered. Another silence, this one softer. Sheriff Hawthorne pulled out a chair and sat down across from them. Up close, in the lamplight, he looked older than Rose had noticed before. Tired. Let me see what you've written, he said to Rose. With shaking fingers, Rose pushed the paper across the table. Her letter, with its careful sentences and determined words, lay between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Sheriff Hawthorne read slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. When he finished, He looked up at Rose with something different in his eyes. "You want to tell your sister about the mountains," he said. "Yes, sir. She's never seen anything bigger than the factory where she works. I want her to know there's something beautiful waiting in the world. And you want her to come here." Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. Sheriff Hawthorne was quiet for another long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A small, tired smile, but real. "Well," he said, "if she's anything like her sister, she'll find a way to make it happen." He stood up, pausing at the kitchen door. "Next time you want to have midnight lessons," he said to Thomas. "Maybe warn an old man first. Scared the hell out of me hearing voices downstairs. Thought we had intruders." After he left, Rose and Thomas sat in the lamplight, holding hands across the letter that had somehow become their Declaration of Independence. The crisis had passed, but something had changed between all of them. Something that couldn't be taken back. Rose picked up her pen and added one more line to her letter. "There are good people here who are learning to love me." The words were crooked and the ink blotted in places, but they carried all the hope she had been afraid to feel. As she wrote, Thomas realized that his father's acceptance, hard won as it was, meant they had crossed some invisible line. The real test would come when Rose's sister answered the letter, when their family was asked to open its doors not just to one working girl, but to the whole world of need and hope that came with her. The morning Rose saw her sister walking down Main Street, she thought she was seeing a ghost. Lily moved like smoke between the buildings, her dress hanging loose on bones that remembered better times. Her hair had grown long and wild, catching the desert light in ways that made her look older than her 16 years. But Rose knew that walk, the careful way Lily placed each foot, as if the ground might give way beneath her. Rose dropped the washing basket. Wet sheets fell into the dirt, but she didn't notice. Her feet carried her forward without thought, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind her, she heard Thomas call her name, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. "Lily!" The word came out broken, like something that had been waiting too long to be spoken. The girl stopped walking. For a moment, they stood facing each other across 20 feet of dusty street. Two women who had shared the same small bed, the same empty belly, the same mother who had loved them when she remembered how. Then Lily's face crumpled, and Rose was running. They crashed together in the middle of the street, Rose's arms wrapping around a body that felt too small, too fragile. Lily smelled like train smoke and unwashed hair and something else. Something that reminded Rose of their mother in her final days. "Fear. I didn't know where else to go," Lily whispered against Rose's shoulder. Rose pulled back to look at her sister's face. There were new lines around Lily's eyes, and her lips were chapped from too much sun. But it was still the face Rose had kissed goodnight for years, still the girl who had crawled into her bed during thunderstorms. "You're here now," Rose said, and meant it with every part of herself. "You're home." From the corner of her eye, Rose saw the town watching. Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch, arms crossed. Old Pete had stopped sweeping outside the saloon. Even the preacher had come out of his church to stare. She knew what they were thinking. They all remembered when Lily had left. How she'd run off with that traveling man. How she'd chosen the bright promise of somewhere else over the steady dust of home. A decent girl would have written letters. A decent girl would have come back married or not at all. But Rose didn't care what they thought. She took Lily's hand and led her toward the house, past the watching eyes and the whispered judgments. Thomas met them at the door, his face unreadable. "This is Lily," Rose said, though she knew he'd already guessed. "My sister." Thomas looked at the girl, really looked at her the way he looked at horses to see if they were worth saving. Rose held her breath, waiting for his decision to shape their lives. Finally, he stepped aside. "Better get her inside. She looks ready to fall over." Relief flooded through Rose like cool water. She guided Lily through the door, into the small parlor that suddenly felt like sanctuary. "Sit," Rose said, pushing her sister toward the good chair by the window. "I'll make coffee." But when she turned toward the kitchen, Lily grabbed her wrist. "Rose, She stopped, looking at Thomas, then back at her sister. There are things I need to tell you. Things that happened. Later, Rose said firmly. First you eat. Then you rest. The talking can wait. She saw the protest rising in Lily's eyes and shook her head. The talking can wait, she repeated, and this time Lily nodded. In the kitchen, Rose's hands shook as she measured coffee grounds. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas asking Lily gentle questions. Where had she come from? How long since she'd eaten? Did she need a doctor? His voice carried the same careful kindness he used with hurt animals. When Rose returned with the coffee, Lily was crying. Not the dramatic tears of a girl, but the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who had carried too much for too long. I made mistakes, Lily said, accepting the cup with both hands. Bad ones. People might come looking. Thomas and Rose exchanged a glance. In it, Rose saw everything she needed to know, that whatever came next, they would face it together. People are always looking for something, Thomas said quietly. Doesn't mean they have the right to find it. That afternoon, Rose helped her sister wash and change into one of her own dresses. In the privacy of their bedroom, Lily told her story in pieces. The traveling man who had promised her cities and left her in a cow town 50 miles from nowhere. The saloon job that had kept her fed but cost her more than money. The baby she'd lost before it could draw breath. Rose listened without judgment, braiding her sister's clean hair with the same gentle patience she'd shown when Lily was small. Some stories, she understood, were shaped like wounds. They hurt to tell, but healing couldn't begin until they were exposed to air. By evening, word had spread through town. The preacher's wife came by with a pie and carefully worded questions. Mrs. Henderson sent her oldest boy with a plate of biscuits and obvious instructions to peek through windows. Even Dr. Morrison found an excuse to stop by, though his examination of Lily was thorough and kind. Each visitor left with a little less certainty about what they'd expected to find. Lily was polite but quiet, helping Rose with evening chores and sitting beside Thomas as he read from the newspaper. She looked, Rose realized with pride, like exactly what she was. A young woman who had traveled far and was grateful to have found her way home. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep in the small back room they'd prepared for her, Rose and Thomas sat on their porch in comfortable silence. The desert stretched out before them, vast and forgiving under stars that asked no questions about a person's past. The town will talk, Thomas said eventually. Let them. Some folks might make trouble. Rose turned to look at her husband, this good man who had opened his door to her sister without hesitation, who had seen pain and responded with shelter. Then we'll handle trouble. Thomas nodded, reaching over to take her hand. His calloused fingers intertwined with hers, making promises that didn't need words. In the distance, a coyote called out to the night, its voice carrying loneliness and longing across the empty miles. But inside their small house, warmth and safety surrounded three people who had chosen each other over the easier path of judgment. Rose thought about the women in town, how they would whisper about fallen girls and ruined reputations. How they would shake their heads and speak of shame as if it were a permanent stain rather than something that could be washed clean with time and forgiveness. But sitting there in the darkness, feeling her sister's presence like a prayer answered, Rose knew something they didn't. Love wasn't about deserving or earning. It wasn't about being perfect or making the right choices. It was about showing up when someone needed you, about opening your door when the world had closed its heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new decisions to be made. But tonight, her family was whole again, and that was enough to quiet any storm the future might bring. The stars wheeled overhead, marking time in their ancient way, and Rose wondered what other lost souls might find their way home before the season turned. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.